I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I would also like to extend those respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. Welcome to the ACT and Region chapter of the Australian Citizen Science Association presentation by Adam Woods, DigiVol, a world leader in facilitating volunteer contributions to science. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Adam Woods. Adam is currently the DigiVol Online Coordinator at the Australian Museum. Having spent more than 10 years working in community engagement and environmental management, he's witnessed firsthand the potential for citizen science to be a valuable tool for education, engagement, and science. Captivated by the knowledge held within the community, Adam saw the need to embrace and record this knowledge, to provide land managers and researchers with more data to guide decisions across the future of Australia's biodiversity. Adam spent 2 years working on the Australian Museum's FrogID before moving to DigiVol in May 2020. Adam, over to you.
Thank you for the kind words, John, and thanks for the introduction. I'd also like to pay my respects and acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the first people and traditional custodians of the land and waterways on which the Australian Museum stands, and also acknowledge the Aboriginal people of the Darawal Nation, from which I am fortunate enough to be presenting from tonight here in Wollongong on the south coast of New South Wales. I was going to spend the first couple of minutes introducing myself, but John has already done that. So I'd just like to highlight that if there are a few familiar names in the audience and faces, but anyone who knows me knows I'm really passionate about citizen science, and I really love learning more about it, getting better as a practitioner in citizen science, and hearing more from our volunteers in particular. Volunteers and their stories just fascinate me. So being in citizen science is a really fortunate opportunity for myself, and I really love it. So apologies if I ramble on a little bit tonight. I do get a little bit excited and go down a few tangents, but I'll try my best to stay on track tonight. And of course, if you've got any questions, happy to stick around and chat for as long as it takes at the end to answer everything that is asked. So to kick it off, the Australian Museum has more than 21 million specimens. It's quite a collection, but only 1% of that collection is actually on display to the public. So across our museum, you only see 1% of the total collection that we have. I guess the museum is like a library for biodiversity. You can see things on site. There's a lot of digital records. And there's also loans, which are critical to the operations of the museum and the research that it's involved in. But interestingly enough, less than 30% of the Australian Museum collection is digitised. So that led to a few questions being asked. And about 10 years ago, the Australian Museum with Paul Flemons started a collaboration with the Atlas of Living Australia to start this ambitious project called DigiVol, looking to, I guess, digitise more of the Australian Museum's collection. So those who are familiar with DigiVol would be really familiar with this front page that you can see here. This is what the website looks like, and the tools that are available for volunteers to use, but also for institutions. And what this looked like 10 years ago is very different to now. It's evolved, it's grown, and it's become multi-purpose. So it really is, it's grown into quite a large crowdsourcing platform for a range of institutions to transcribe information. I guess that term crowdsourcing is a little bit strange as well. So just for those who might be unfamiliar with some of the terminology, Crowdsourcing is generally an open call for voluntary assistance from a large group of individuals. That's the technical definition, but I think citizen science kind of has a lot of definitions and a lot of ways of looking at it and perspectives. So rather than get tied up in the terminology, you might see me use the term citizen science and crowdsourcing interchangeably tonight. Like I mentioned, a number of institutions use DigiVol, the Australian Museum being the main collaborators and instigators of the project early on. It's very important to the digitisation of our collection, but any institution can use DigiVol and transcribe their data, whether that's across their own collections, herbariums, or camera trap images, which we'll touch on a little bit later on. So why DigiVol continues to exist has kind of evolved for the Australian Museum. The Australian Museum is now in the second year of its 10-year project that we call the Collection Enhancement Project. There's three broad goals in relation to that project, and that's the registration and digitisation of 2 million specimens over the next 10 years across natural history and cultural collections. There's also high resolution imaging and 3D scanning taking place on particularly high valued specimens. And it's the enhancement and enrichment of natural history and cultural collection specimens through targeted research or additional information capture. So some of the collection and their labels in particular holds data that hasn't necessarily been unlocked for the research community. And hopefully the Collection Enhancement Project will help that happen. So why are we interested in driving this project? I guess the main purpose is to create better access to the Australian Museum's collections for stakeholders, whether they be internal or external. Engagement opportunities exist across all the collections. So as we start to digitise them, the opportunity to expose and talk about these collections will be much greater. Digital repatriation of First Nations material, substitute for objects in the event of loss. So if something happens to the collection, we have a digital record available, although it won't replace the specimen itself. At least we'll have records of what we had. To fulfil audit, tracking and inventory obligations, there's the state government coming into it, and assist in preserving the collection through limiting handling and associated with the collection access. So if we can provide data and information to people, that means they don't have to go into the collection and take out specimens, then the specimens are likely to exist for much longer. So how does DigiVol contribute and work with the Collection Enhancement Project? I guess there's two elements to that. We have a lab on site where volunteers visit the museum and they unpin specimens and they take photos of them, and all this becomes data that goes into our the Australian Museum database. And then there's the online component, which is what we're really here to talk about tonight, which is the transcription of labels and registered data that the Australian Museum has. We have a lot of information that is sitting in old volumes that we would like to unlock and make available to researchers. So I guess if you were going to simplify the process that DigiVol goes through, I think these 5 steps sum it up quite nicely. So initially, if you're an institution such as ourselves and you wanted to put some content on DigiVol Online, you would be talking about setting up an expedition with a template and a tutorial, and anyone who's been through that process knows that's the hardest bit. Then you upload batches of images to the DigiVol website and the project is created. That's when that is then open to the public, and citizen scientists digitise the images according to the specifications of the institution running the project. And then there's a quality control where experts check the information for accuracy and consistency. And then there's obviously the option to download and export the data to use it within your own systems and share it more broadly with the wider community. So there's three, I guess, key areas that DigiVol operates under. The first one we'll talk about is specimen labels, mainly because that is the major focus of our own digitisation at the museum. We have a lot of insect labels from entomology. We have a lot of rock and mineral labels. We have a lot of, well, other institutions have a lot of plant labels and herbarium specimens. But essentially, the specimen labels allows us to digitise large volumes of data and makes it catalogued and searchable. It also divides that data into relevant fields as well. So if we use something like OCR, it can transcribe the data, but it doesn't necessarily break it into the fields that we want to put it in when we move it to another database. So an example of a project on DigiVol Online, this is what a basic insect label transcription looks like. You can see there that we're transcribing all the text. We're collecting locality information, who collected it, dates and other miscellaneous information, sometimes how it was collected, whether it was in a trap or in a lamp or something like that. But also, yeah, there's an opportunity to map the locations a bit more specifically as well, using a built-in toggle there within the template. So you can see there that we can capture quite a bit of information from a single label on an insect specimen. There's also our field diaries element. This is handwritten text generally. It can also be text associated with maps and other illustrations, as you can see from the images there. But you can also look at drawing out the biodiversity data from that text as well. So a lot of these texts actually hold some really interesting biodiversity information. And we also create digital records of journals and registers that otherwise are still sitting there as handwritten records. It also preserves the content of past record keeping methods for the future. So for us here at the museum, the main field diaries that we work, or the main type of handwritten text we work in, is a register, the old museum registers, which show every single specimen coming into the museum, and capturing some of that data is really helpful for the research being undertaken on those collections. So what that might look like, here's a good example of a diary from William Brewster, a well-known ornithologist. You can see there's just one big box there that allows us to transcribe every bit of text, but just below that there's a little few extra boxes. So when a person doing that transcribing comes across an actual record of a bird, they can put that in those boxes at the bottom, and that can they can add as many rows as they need. So if he saw a single bird, then they could put that in there and then keep adding rows if he saw a different species and so on. So yeah, it allows, I guess, all that information about biodiversity to be drawn out of those often quite lengthy journal entries. And probably in the last couple of years, the rise in popularity of camera trap images on DigiVol has been something that has got a little bit of press, and from looking at those images, you see why. There's a few elements to this for our volunteers to get involved with. That might be just a simple animal identification and numbers of animals in those images. It might be questions about animal behaviour. Volunteers are contributing to studies on critically endangered species around Australia, predominantly. And more recently, there's been quite a few projects set up that are in relation to the recovery of bushfire impacted environments, which is really, gives volunteers an opportunity to get involved and do something a little bit hands-on where otherwise they might not feel they could. And yeah, obviously scientists understand the impacts of bushfire and biodiversity on biodiversity and ecosystems. And that goes to a lot of other different areas as well, such as climate change and animal behaviour. What does a camera trap project look like? Here's an example of koala drinkers. This was a New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and Environment project. They had the koala drinkers out in Gunnedah, and they had some cameras set on those drinkers to try and understand what animals were using those drinkers, and whether it was koalas or more. And as you can see here, there's a little visitor to one of those drinking stations. So they were capturing all of that data around what animals and what species were benefiting from the use of these watering stations out in Gunnedah during the drought in particular. Okay, so stepping away from the projects for a minute, I guess there's a really big element of DigiVol that revolves around the volunteers. And at the moment, we've got a little over 9,000 registered volunteers from around the world, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. And over the last 10 years, there's been more than 3 million tasks completed. And for those who are citizen science buffs out there, yes, we do experience the traditional citizen science long tail, meaning that a small number of volunteers do a large portion of the work. The top 1% of our volunteers actually contribute 62% of the data generated on DigiVol. But I guess COVID brought about a lot of challenges for society, but being an online platform for crowdsourcing, we really benefited from those conditions of people being at home and spending time on their computers and looking for things to do. So in 2020 alone, we had 3,841 new volunteers sign up to DigiVol. And if you have a look at this bar graph, you can see there's those yellow columns are standing pretty tall above anything that has happened in the past for DigiVol. That can also be said for the number of transcriptions that we completed in 2020. Again, those yellow columns stand very tall above what's happened in the past on the DigiVol platform. This can also be attributed to the rise of the wildlife spotter projects as well. So those transcriptions are much quicker. I don't want to say easier, because I think less complex is probably the right way to describe them, in that you're not transcribing multiple fields. You're generally looking for an animal in an image. So yeah, the rise of the popularity of those projects, and of course we had multiple wildlife spotter projects being transcribed on DigiVol throughout 2020, with the Save Our Species program at the New South Wales government being responsible for the vast majority of those. So obviously, like I say, there's a sharp increase since lockdown, and there was more than 30 projects live simultaneously. So if you look at the site now, usually there's somewhere between 10 and 20, but there was 30 projects at a time, and it was really humming along the website, that's for sure. A bit of a breakdown of what happened in 2020. We had 287 specimen label expeditions and a little over 200,000 transcriptions, 784 field note expeditions with about 60,000 transcriptions. And like I mentioned, the camera trap expeditions were quite popular, with over 700 of those, and yeah, creeping up towards 4 million transcriptions on those wildlife projects. But if you dig a little bit deeper into that data, you can see that while camera traps account for the vast majority of transcriptions, when you look a little bit closer, you can see that actually it was those field note style transcriptions, the diaries, and the registers that people were working on. It's a really time-consuming task, and that was actually the most time spent by our volunteers. and our volunteers spent nearly 100,000 hours in 2020 transcribing things on the DigiVol platform, which is just, yeah, remarkable number of hours of volunteer labour. Okay, so enough about the stats and all of those kinds of things. Might move on to some examples of institutions and projects that are available on DigiVol. So, like I mentioned, it's not just the Australian Museum using the platform. There is a number of other institutions around the world. And one of those institutions is the New York Botanic Garden, their herbarium, and they're looking at getting a lot of their herbarium specimens and their labels transcribed so that they can extract that data and use it for their research. So a few examples for them. There's a tree fern project in the past that was quite popular. They do air plants to pineapples, bromeliads, which a lot of people in Australia would be familiar with. And then a most recent one, which I'm just fascinated by, and I really like that image, is the epiphytes, guardians of the canopy, they call this project, which is just looking at all the epiphytic plants, I guess, that are up in the canopy, which is just fascinating to explore. What's really great about these New York Botanic Gardens projects is the connection that you can get with the collection team. They are really open to questions and feedback. They use the forum on DigiVol really well, and you can really talk to the team and other volunteers and find out lots of information about the plants and the people who collected them. They maintain a really strong dialogue with the community of volunteers involved with their projects. So it's a really great example of doing transcription well, I think. And just as an organisation, they run some really great workshops and open days for volunteers too. An example from our museum at the Australian Museum, we have the paleontology collection involved. It's quite a interesting element of DigiVol, but the collection consists of specimens of fossils, invertebrates, and plants, mostly from around Australia. But our collection has particular strengths in the mammals and fossil fish section. You might be thinking, what on earth can we transcribe relating to fossils on DigiVol? We're actually working on a project right now that is, we call it Data Fossil. It's utilising citizen science to help determine the age and environmental characteristics of fossil sites around Australia. So there's a number of fossil sites, and we're going to hold a webinar on this project specifically next week, where you'll find out more. But yeah, there is some really great information to be garnered from taking images using a scanning electron microscope and identifying the microscopic pollen that is within those images. The data will provide scientists with information about abundance and the variety of pollen and microfossils found on sites. For a bit of context there, that image is of pollen, and it's 40 microns in width, and so that is just 0.04 of a millimetre. So you can imagine how many images we can take of a single specimen and how long that would take to actually transcribe all that information. So volunteers have been involved in that, and yeah, it's showing some promising results already. A really great wildlife spotter project, Bush Heritage Australia, have been involved in DigiVol for a while, but more recently we've been talking about getting a few more reserves involved, and they're working on getting some more expeditions online as we speak. But they do some great work in conservation of unique landscapes around Australia, and I'm sure you've all heard of them and follow their work. I won't talk too much about them, just to say that this is the cute and cuddly side of DigiVol. There's some really interesting animals and some really great snapshots of the biodiversity that exists out there in the Australian environment. And this is a really great way to see it in places, I guess, otherwise you may not be able to visit. So a lot of the reserves getting involved are over in Western Australia and outback South Australia. So yeah, it's a really unique way to connect to the Australian environment in those areas of the country. And more recently, the museum is also putting up some entomology projects. With COVID restrictions starting to ease, our lab is starting to get back into full swing. They've got their work cut out for them with nearly 1.7 million specimens in the entomology collection at the museum, and only 20% so far have been digitised. There's going to be a lot of work ahead of us in transcribing the information from those labels and photographing all of those specimens. So our lab is in full swing now, and just today I opened our first expedition on DigiVol that is a flies expedition. Doing a little bit of research on those flies just to write the description for this project. It's really fascinating to see the variation in colour and habit and what these flies get up to. So yeah, I recommend jumping on and checking out some of these really unique specimens that the Australian Museum is lucky enough to have, and supporting the digitisation of that. And more recently, I think it's important that DigiVol has been involved in supporting some community organisations to get some content online. So it's really great to see organisations such as Wandiali Restoration Trust come on board. This is the neck of the woods of the ACT in the Molonglo Range there, around the Murrumbidgee River. At their sanctuary, they have a range of camera traps put out to monitor the wildlife, and those images are ending up on DigiVol and getting transcribed by the volunteers. So this is a fantastic way to see community organisations benefiting from the work that we do. And it's nice that I guess some of these organisations don't have the resources of government bodies to get this work done. So it's really great for us to be able to offer that resource to the community. And the same can be said for Blue Derby Wild, who recently came on board as well, just in the last month. They're a grassroots community group working to protect forests in Tasmania. And again, another way to see some really unique Australian wildlife. Their cameras capture lots of things. Obviously, a lot of paddy melons, but also there's a chance of a Tassie devil and a quoll and that sort of thing popping up on those kind of cameras. Okay, so I guess there's unlimited possibilities on DigiVol. Here's, I guess, a name drop slide. These are all the institutions who are using DigiVol, and I guess it shows you the variety of projects from local councils and for the history buffs who are interested in that local government history. There's lots of transcribing to be done for them. The founders and survivors and Libraries Tasmania have been putting up some really fascinating stuff around. There's been, I think I call it, the best description is, if you're into true crime podcasts, you might be into this kind of stuff, with a lot of court case transcription and punishment transcription for crime and things like that. But yeah, like you can see, there's some really great herbariums from around the country and indeed the world, and a range of other charities and things using the website as well. And all of these institutions have some really great projects achieving some great outcomes for the environment and for their research. Okay, so I guess the next step is to get involved. There's no better time than now. This week now, the next 4 days is actually We Dig Bio, which is an event. It's a global event that looks to get people engaged in digitising bio collections. And DigiVol has been a strong part of that, being involved in digitisation around the world. And the next 4 days, you'll see lots of new and interesting projects go up on DigiVol. All you have to do is register through the ALA and through digivol.org. Have a look at the projects that are there, see if there's anything that takes your fancy. Have a read of some tutorials and guides. There's lots of really helpful information online to help you get started, and then start transcribing. It really is a fascinating way to connect with some interesting biodiversity and collections around the world. So yeah, I recommend anyone jump on and have a look. If you want to dip your toes in the water and do some wildlife spotter, go for it. If you want to get down into some interesting data crunching, then yeah, get into some transcription of labels and things like that. Yeah, there's definitely plenty to be learned out there. Obviously, a plug for our conversation on not just our forums online, but on our social media as well. You can find us at AM DigiVol on Twitter and Facebook. We're always posting about interesting things that we find and interesting projects that are hitting our platform. And yeah, so you can always keep in touch with us via those platforms as well. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, if you know me, I love talking about citizen science. So this, I guess, is the opportunity to open it up to questions and really start a conversation now. If you've got any questions about DigiVol and the platform and how it works, or yeah, about any of the projects I've mentioned, then yeah, please ask your questions now.
So thanks for that, Adam. Some people have entered questions into the chat screen, and I'd encourage people, if you've got questions, to do so. From Tim, who verifies the data? Are they museum staff or other volunteers?
Okay, so that varies from institution to institution. So for the museum, we have some skilled volunteers who support that, along with our scientists from our collections. But yeah, that can kind of change depending on the institution. Some institutions will only use, yeah, like verified scientists to do that validation, whereas others are a bit more flexible depending on like what they're trying to do and what they intend to do with that data. So yeah, it's definitely variable.
Is it reasonable to say, Adam, that the initial transcription is done by any volunteer, but the validation of it is done by appointed people? Yeah,
definitely. And and sometimes that is a volunteer, because there is some really highly skilled volunteers within the community as well. And some institutions recognise that and need that extra support. But yeah, some institutions are also really protective of what kind of information can go to that next step. So yeah, they will tend to keep it in-house for all of that validation.
Fair enough. Linda makes a comment. I imagine you'll be keen to have citizen scientists who can read cursive.
Yes, definitely. If you've got interest in reading 1800s handwriting, that's really helpful. But it doesn't seem to matter when the handwriting was written. It's always really hard to transcribe. It doesn't matter if it was 10 years ago or 100 years ago. For some reason, it's always difficult to work out. So yeah, definitely if you've got that ability to read that historical kind of cursive handwriting, then that would be very helpful.
Fair enough. I believe it's a dying art, shall we say?
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
I'm going to mispronounce this name, and I apologise to the person. Sibone Leachman has said, do you share the transcriptions of field books, etc., with any other organisations? I know the Biodiversity Heritage Library replaces the OCR with the volunteer-made transcriptions from the Smithsonian Transcription Centre. Is the same process happening with the DigiVol transcriptions of handwritten field books?
Yeah. So again, it really does depend on what is being transcribed. The bulk of our transcriptions in that long form are actually registers. So people aren't all that interested in that information. But we definitely, through our archive section at the museum, they are connected to the Biodiversity Heritage Library, and they put all the information that we can up there. We're actually about to start a new project with them that is based purely on getting data to the Biodiversity Heritage Library. So yeah, definitely for us at the museum, it's important and an important step, just when it's suitable for what we're having transcribed. We don't tend to have a lot of those long form journals, but I haven't necessarily spoken to some of those institutions who do either. So I wouldn't know. We'd have to suss them out and find out what they do with that information.
I know my own organisation has put up a number of field journals, but my organisation, being Geoscience Australia, tends to be looking at rocks rather than biodiversity type aspects. Yeah. And I must apologise, the name I mispronounced before, I have been corrected. It's Siobhan, and I apologise, Siobhan. From Janet, has there been any projects that have used AI to identify the animal / plant, then use the citizen scientist to classification on DigiVol to validate?
The short answer to that is not that I'm aware of. Some institutions do use AI to remove the false positives from their data before they put it on DigiVol. So AI seems to have come along far enough where they're reasonably confident with the removal of that information from data sets. As far as identifying animals, there's a lot of different players in that game that are at different stages, and it's a very complicated world to navigate, and we're definitely looking into what the possibilities are for DigiVol and how AI can be incorporated in the future. It's a fascinating world, but I think the technology has a ways to come yet before it becomes more reliable and reliable enough for us to invest in integrating it into the platform.
Janet's come back and said, you know, I guess then that AI could then be used to train. AI could then be trained using the DigiVol labelled classes.
Yeah, we do get approached very frequently about access to data sets from DigiVol on animals and things like that. But for us, we don't own any of that data. Any data that goes up on DigiVol, the Australian Museum, me working for the Australian Museum, we're in control of our own data. But if another organisation uses DigiVol, such as Wandiali or Conservation Volunteers or the New South Wales DPIE, we don't own any of the transcription data they do. That's theirs. And so it's trying to bring all those players to the table together, which is the challenge.
Fair enough. You're being very diplomatic with your responses. Siobhan has come up with another question. She says, given the growth of numbers of volunteers in 2020, do you see this continuing to grow in 2021, or do you see this dropping off? Do you do much recruitment to get more new volunteers into DigiVol?
Yeah, so we've already seen a drop off since 2020, but that can be associated to a couple of things as well. We transcribed everything that the New South Wales Save Our Species program had as far as wildlife spotter projects are concerned. So they kind of were like, we're swimming in data and we don't want to produce anymore. So they stopped putting projects up. And in line with that, started more people returning to work and things like that as well. We don't necessarily do a huge amount of promotion for new volunteers, just through social media, word of mouth, and on some volunteer platforms here in Australia. But yeah, like we could be stronger in that area, that's for sure. But it's more of a resourcing thing than not having enough work for people to do.
Fair enough. Janet's asked, do the transcriptions use open access licenses?
That's an interesting question. It depends on the institution, I think. So I might need more in that question.
Janet, if you're able to provide some further clarification on the question, if you want to stick it in the chat. Meanwhile, we'll go on to Stuart's question. Any incentive or encouragement for private collectors of invertebrate, primarily, that's where Stuart's focus is, to contribute / digitise?
No, and it's not something that we have discussed, I guess, and not something that's come up, but it's interesting. I'm interested to talk about it. Because, and that has been something that has come up from a camera trap perspective. So if someone has camera traps on their private land, would they be able to use DigiVol? In short, the answer is yes. We don't necessarily turn people away. So if there was a private collector who wanted to do something or needed support in digitisation, then I'm sure we could do that. But I guess the motivations would have to be right for that collector to get that information and be sharing it with the broader community, I think.
As you indicated, as you're going through, Adam, the initial impost on the person that's organising the expedition is not insignificant, with having to set up the templates and things like that.
Definitely. So
it's probably not something you'd do for a relatively small number of images, but that's all things possible. Janet's come back and said the CSIRO DAP has a range of licenses we can ascribe to data, e.g. Creative Commons, etc. She's just added DAP stands for Data Access Portal.
Yeah. So we don't, for our own data, it ends up in, as far as the Australian Museum goes, that data ends up in the in our own database, and then everything goes to the ALA. So it's all open and usable by researchers once it hits the ALA. But as far as what other institutions do and how they, whether they have any licensing around their data, I couldn't be sure. I can't answer that question for you. A little bit outside of the scope of my, my expertise.
One of the questions that is asked when you're setting up a project is, do you agree to your data going through to the ALA? Which I suspect by default means it becomes Creative Commons. But I'm not the expert, as you say. Siobhan's come back and said, just a comment. I know some institutions in DigiVol use Creative Commons licensing, both their data and their images, but some institutions used closed licenses such as Creative Commons Attribution non-commercial use. Some, like the NYBG, are CC0 for data and CC BY for images.
And I think that would be, as far as the museum's concerned, is the non-commercial use for what we do. That seems to be pretty standard for government, because we are, the Australian Museum is part of the New South Wales government.
Fair enough. Okay, ladies and gents, Dennis just said thank you. I'm assuming that's for the information that's been provided. Now, if there's any other questions, you by all means at this stage open your mics up and ask them directly. I'll give a moment for someone to do that if there is.
It's Siobhan Leachman here. Can you hear me?
We can indeed, Siobhan.
I just wanted to point out that if you are using a closed license, the non-commercial use license in the Australian Museum, that is such a shame, because I tend to use images and data in Wikipedia and Wikidata. And also I tend to be biased in favour of institutions when I volunteer for those that use open licenses. So for example, currently I'm actually using DigiVol and volunteering for DigiVol, and I'm very careful about picking the projects I volunteer for. I go and double check how openly they license both their data as well as the images that I'm actually transcribing, because I'm volunteering. I want to make sure that anyone and everyone, commercial, non-commercial, can use that data. So I just want to make that comment.
Yeah, and it's a good comment, and it's an interesting, I don't want to call it a can of worms, but when you work in government, they tend to be...
No, you can kill it. It is a can of worms. It's 100% a can of worms.
Yeah, it is. And when you work in government, everything tends to be, they err on the side of caution, especially around public money generating things that can be then used for commercial use. So yeah, there's a whole lot of things to unpack in that. Like I said, it's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. I know a bit about it through association rather than being an expert in it. But yeah, it's definitely it's worth debate.
It would be one area where I think as a volunteer, I would like DigiVol to actually improve, is to make it, because I have to go and, the way I work it out is go look at the Global Biodiversity Information Framework, which is where a lot of the data from a lot of these institutions actually end up, including the ALA. It all gets aggregated into the Global Biodiversity Information Framework or Facility. Yeah. I can't remember what the F stands for. And so if you go in there and look at the institution's data sets as well as particular images in those data sets, you can see the licensing they've put on the data set and the licensing that they've put on the images.
Yeah.
Now, some people may not be quite as uptight about it as I am, but I'm very much an advocate for open reuse, especially if I'm the one creating the data or helping to create the data. Yeah.
Yeah. And then like we've spoken to a lot of people, and we know Google's creeping around behind the scenes as well, doing some AI stuff with animals. And
yeah, I understand concerns, and there are, especially when it comes to Indigenous people, there's massive concerns about cultural status works. That's 100%, obviously there are concerns around that. And that's why it is a can of worms. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, not a problem we'll solve in the next 8 minutes, but definitely something that I think more and more that's coming up. I think I attended a few Citizen Science Association in the US. They did a whole bunch of stuff about attribution and best practice over there. And that started the conversation about licensing too. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves for citizen science in the future. I think, like you said, transparency is probably the most important thing at the moment in terms of being clear about what your licensing is, so that volunteers can make an informed decision. You probably shouldn't have to go and research it somewhere else before you just...
Yeah, because a lot of people wouldn't know where to look. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That
some
would
institutions would happily hide behind that, and others would just be like, oh, we weren't aware that this existed.
Yeah, exactly. Or I've had situations where I've volunteered for a particular project, which I won't mention, and they've then put the content that I've spent hours on behind a paywall and commercialised it themselves, which really made me very annoyed. So that's why, one of the reasons why I'm so careful nowadays, even though, it is biodiversity and I love it. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that, Siobhan. Is there any other questions from people, please? We are sort of getting towards the end of the allocated hour, but if there are questions, I'm moderately sure Adam's happy to answer them.
Hi, John. It's Michelle Neal here. How are you?
Not too bad, Michelle.
Adam, I do have a question for you. We were talking about the future of DigiVol. I'm just wondering, can anyone put a project on DigiVol?
Yeah. So we don't necessarily vet people. If you inquire and like usually it'll land in my desk which is pretty normal. I would just send you a whole bunch of information about how the platform works and what you need to do. And that gives you a better understanding of the time commitment on your side. Like John mentioned, it's not necessarily a simple process. You do have to invest some time and resources into setup and then management of the projects once they're going. So yeah, but I think most people tend to turn and run at that stage rather than us needing to keep too careful an eye on who uses the platform. And there are other terms of use as well. So yeah, so that's why I do like the idea that more community organisations are starting to use it in running projects. But yeah, definitely anyone can jump on board, and I believe the actual code for the DigiVol website is also open source. So if you like DigiVol enough and you just wanted to build your own version, you can go and take the code and do it yourself.
Well, there's an option for you, Michelle. Are there any other questions?
I was thinking about land care groups in particular.
Yeah, so we have been approached by a number of land care groups, but again, it's that setup phase and the amount of effort that you have to put in at the start that tends to scare them away, being as resource poor as they tend to be. So yeah, you do need a dedicated volunteer to really help make that happen. So we're pretty close with Upper Murrumbidgee Land Care to getting some projects online. We've got a template developed for them and everything like that, but it's about finding the time and being able to put those up online and make it all happen.
Yeah. So putting together the template and the tutorial on how to use the template are probably the most, well, I've found the most time-consuming elements, and there are many hours in doing that properly. Yeah.
And yeah, that can impact the quality of your data and the volunteer experience and everything as well. So it's important that you spend that time there. And having a really clear concept of where you want your data to go and how useful it's going to be is important as well. So there's not much point in getting 1,000 things transcribed if there's no intent to use the data in any way as well. And often community organisations don't have that resource to help them make sense of what they're actually seeing on the ground.
Fair enough. Are there any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? Well, it being quiet, we might just...
Oh, sorry. Hi, my name's Nerida. I'm just wondering what kind of skill sets do you require of your volunteer data entry?
That's an interesting... really just the ability to follow the instructions, because tutorials are there to support you through the whole through the whole process. Like was mentioned earlier, if you're going to get into some of the deeper transcription of historical documents, an ability to read challenging handwriting is an advantage. But I guess the people who contribute the most tend to be people who are a little bit into biodiversity and data and the collection of that information. Not to say that you couldn't develop it from being involved in DigiVol, and I'm sure a lot of people have, but yeah, like a lot of people have work histories that are really relevant to understanding information and being able to categorize it and put it in the right place and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's quite diverse, and there's a diverse range of tasks, and some are more complex than others. So yeah, we have school children, for example, doing a lot of the wildlife spotter stuff these days as well. They get involved and they're looking at contributing a bit in that element of DigiVol too. So yeah, like there's a quite diverse range of people and diverse skill set that people can apply to DigiVol.
Cool, thank you.
And Siobhan's put in a vote of thanks, Adam, for the presentation, and very much appreciate the effort. The time's now sort of expired for the session, so unless there's some urgent questions, we might draw it to a close. There's no one leaping to speak. Okay, in which case, I'd like to thank you very much, Adam, for a fascinating presentation today. Put some background on some of the stuff that we've been doing for a little while, and you'll find me knocking on your door in the not too distant future as I set up the next project.
No worries.
What I'd also like to do for those that are members of the Australian Citizen Science Association, there's a members only item out that you will have seen in your membership note to do with Picture a Scientist. It's online access to a documentary that's coming out of the US looking at how gender equity happens within the science community. So I thought I'd advertise that. Okay, ladies and gents, if everyone's finished, I think we might call it a night. Again, thank you very much, Adam. And yeah, everyone, I wish you all a good night, and we'll speak to you soon.